Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful and inspiring tales that touch the heart and speak to the soul. Today, we bring you the story of a woman caught between the pressures of her wealthy, pretentious family and her own desire for a simple, authentic life. Faced with years of manipulation, deceit, and judgment, she must confront the truth and make a life-changing decision. Will she continue to live in the shadow of her family's expectations or break free and build a future on her own terms? Stay tuned to find out. Don't forget to subscribe to start today's story. I stood by the window, gazing out at the garden, its autumn foliage catching the last rays of the sun. The warm golden hues of the leaves contrasted with the chilly air. And for a moment, I could forget everything else. My hand rested gently on my belly, still slightly rounded from the 5 months of pregnancy that had quietly changed my life. Each day, as I felt the small movements inside me, I was reminded of a life growing within me, a tiny soul that filled my heart with serene happiness. In those fleeting moments of peace, I could forget the complicated web of relationships that weighed me down, most of all, the strained relationship I had with my family. It had been 2 years since that fateful birthday party at my father's home. And yet the memory was still vivid, still as raw as it had been that night. My father, Gregory, had turned 60, and my mother, Patricia, had insisted on throwing a grand celebration. It was a spectacle, the kind that demanded attention, expensive champagne, imported wines, and a guest list that read like a who's who of the real estate industry in Chicago. The house was a palace, as opulent as the lives they had built. But it was all a facade, a glittering mask that hid the hollowness beneath. And as always, my mother's sharp tongue cut through everything, revealing the sharp divide between who I was and who they wanted me to be. "Did you buy that dress on sale at a department store?" Patricia's voice rang out, dripping with sarcasm. Her tone was as thinly veiled as the expensive Chanel suit she wore, a constant reminder of the material world they valued above all else. The dress I wore was simple, black, and yes, it had come from a department store. But it represented my values, modesty, comfort, and a life built on sincerity. But to my mother, it was a symbol of everything she disapproved of. I had long given up on defending my choices. Instead, I simply replied, "Yes, I like it." I could feel the sting of her judgment, but I refused to let it show. "Well, with your husband's salary, that's understandable," she said, raising her voice so that others could hear. "A small real estate firm's president doesn't compare to the people here." Her words felt like a slap, but I had learned to take them in stride. Jonathan, my husband, had chosen a different path, a path that wasn't dictated by the expectations of wealth and social standing. He had chosen to follow his passion for real estate, and though his company wasn't one of the giants, it had grown steadily and was doing well. But my parents couldn't see that. To them, success was measured in the size of your house, the designer labels you wore, and the power you could wield in the business world. Jonathan's modest approach to life was something they never understood. My sister, Claire, always the favorite, chimed in then, her voice dripping with condescension. She was draped in an expensive Hermes dress, with a diamond necklace that sparkled like the world was her stage. "Emma, it's rare to see you here," she said, a slight edge to her words. "Usually, you avoid family gatherings, preferring your simple life." I smiled quietly, not allowing her words to affect me. Claire worked for my father's company, but her competence was questionable at best. Still, she had been rewarded with a high salary, a luxurious lifestyle, and a future that was already mapped out for her. She had never had to fight for what she wanted. It had all been handed to her, wrapped in a silver bow. As the night wore on, I overheard my father speaking to a client. The conversation was casual, but the words struck me like a cold wave. "The future of Anderson Real Estate rests on Claire," he boasted, his chest puffed out with pride. "She's showing excellent skills as my successor." I couldn't help but smirk. I knew better. Claire's skills, if they could even be called that, consisted of charming people with her superficial smile and making empty promises. She could talk the talk, But she could never walk the walk. I had always known that. But I kept my thoughts to myself. There was no point in arguing. They had already made up their minds. That evening, I had approached my father, hoping for a brief exchange of pleasantries. But his expression froze when he saw me. "Ah, Emma," he said, forcing a smile. "You came today. Happy birthday." "Happy birthday, Dad," I replied. The words felt hollow, as if they were meant to fill the silence between us. But they did nothing to bridge the emotional gap that had grown over the years. "How is Jonathan?" my father asked, his voice dripping with insincerity. "Still working at that little company of his?" "Yes," I answered, trying not to let his sarcasm affect me. "He's got an important case." "Well, it must be tough being the president of such a small company," my father remarked. "I imagine the scale is different from the big corporations like ours." I couldn't help but notice the undertone of disdain in his words. To him, Jonathan's work meant nothing, just as my choices meant nothing. We were both beneath him, trapped in a world that couldn't measure up to the life he had built. The evening ended with an unexpected remark from my mother. "Emma, I have to tell you something," she said, her face serious, though her makeup was as flawless as always. "It's decided. Claire will inherit the company. You have no say in it. You've betrayed our family tradition by choosing to strike out on your own." Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had always known that my parents didn't approve of my decisions. But hearing it so bluntly was a reminder of how little they valued me. I had chosen a different path. One that didn't rely on the family business. One that didn't rely on their wealth. And in their eyes, that made me a failure. But I didn't pursue it. I didn't fight back. Instead, I left the party that night, my heart heavy with the weight of their words, and vowed to keep my distance from them. It was a choice I made to protect myself, to protect my happiness, and as I stood there now, looking out at the changing colors of the trees, I knew that I had made the right choice. But the shadow of my family's expectations still loomed large over me. A reminder that the price of independence was often loneliness. Weeks passed since I'd last seen my family. Life had moved forward in its quiet, simple rhythm. Jonathan and I had settled into our routine, the small joys of our lives taking precedence over the noise of the world. But the call I received one day broke that peace. It was my mother, and as soon as I saw her name on the screen, my stomach tightened. I had been avoiding her for months. Not because I hated her, but because I couldn't bear the constant weight of her judgments. She had never approved of my life choices, and each encounter only reminded me of how different I was from the world she expected me to live in. "Emma, I need to talk to you about your baby shower," she said without preamble, her voice crisp with authority. "Next Saturday, I've arranged a celebration at Lysander. Be there at 7:30 sharp." Lysander. It was one of the most exclusive, expensive French restaurants in the city, known for its extravagant prices and impeccable service. The name alone was enough to make my skin crawl. My mother always chose these extravagant places for occasions. Places that showed the world how important she thought we were. I wanted to say no. To refuse the forced celebration. But I knew better. Saying no would only bring more criticism. More disdain. "Mom, it doesn't have to be somewhere that fancy," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "We can celebrate just fine without the need to show off." Her tone sharpened immediately. "It's my first grandchild. It deserves to be celebrated properly. Or do you intend to stick to your usual modest ways? As always?" The words cut like a blade, sharp with the years of criticism she'd leveled at me for not fitting into the life she wanted for me. The call ended with a final, condescending remark from her. "Don't forget to show up." I could almost see the smugness in her voice, the certainty that she was doing something grand for me. But I knew it was about appearances. Nothing more. Soon after, a message arrived from Claire, my sister. "Make sure you come this time," it said. "It's sad that you always avoid us. Mom and Dad are really worried about you." It was just like Claire to hide her malice under a veneer of concern. Her words were like daggers disguised as pity, reminding me that I had always been the odd one out in this family. "Jonathan," ever the voice of reason, quietly placed his hand on my shoulder as I stared at the screen. My heart sinking. You don't have to go if you don't want to. You don't need to listen to them. But I was tired of running away. Tired of being the one who hid from the chaos they created. I'll go, I said, my voice steady but resolute. It's time to settle everything. That night, I sat in our study, flipping through an old photo album. The pictures were from a time before everything had changed. Before my decision to leave the corporate world and strike out on my own. My parents had mocked me for that choice. Ridiculed me for stepping away from the security of their wealth and connections. They had never understood my desire to find happiness on my own terms. To build something meaningful that didn't depend on inherited power or privilege. It was in those early days of independence that I met Jonathan. He had been the president of a small real estate company, and though his business was modest compared to the giants my family had surrounded themselves with, he had something my family didn't: integrity. He worked tirelessly, believing in hard work and treating people with respect. He saw value in me for who I was, not for my family name or the wealth I could bring. We had fallen in love despite the disapproval of my family. And even though Jonathan's company was far from the industry titans my parents admired, he had built it from the ground up, slowly and steadily, and still, my family never saw him for who he truly was. To them, he would always be just a small-time businessman, unworthy of their approval. I couldn't shake the feeling that my decision to marry him was a rebellion in their eyes. A choice that would forever estrange me from them. But I had never regretted it. And now, with a child on the way, it felt like the beginning of something even more beautiful. Something that would not be tainted by the pretenses of my family's world. The following Saturday, I arrived at Lysander, dressed in a simple, elegant maternity dress. It wasn't the extravagant outfit my mother would have expected, but it was the kind of choice that made me feel at ease with myself. The restaurant, with its glistening chandeliers and plush decor, felt suffocating to me, a reminder of everything I had chosen to leave behind. I stepped out of the taxi, my heart pounding in my chest. But what awaited inside would be even more suffocating. I stepped into Lysander, the heavy brass door swinging open before me with a soft creak. The chandeliers above bathed the room in a cold, almost oppressive light, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just walked into a trap. The marble floors gleamed under the glow of the crystals, but the elegance of the place only served to remind me of the facade my family had carefully constructed all these years. I walked across the floor, my heels clicking loudly in the otherwise hushed atmosphere. The hostess greeted me with a polite smile and led me to the private dining room where I had been told my family was waiting. But as she opened the door to the room, the sight that greeted me made my stomach turn. The table was littered with empty wine bottles, half-eaten plates, and discarded glasses. My mother, Patricia, sat at the head, her expression forced, wearing her usual Chanel jacket, her makeup slightly smudged from what I assumed had been hours of dining and drinking. My father, Gregory, was seated next to her, his face tense and uncomfortable, as though he knew what was about to unfold. And there, at the far end of the table, sat Claire, her phone in hand, her smug smile betraying the malice hidden beneath her otherwise perfect exterior. "Oh, Emma, you finally arrived," Patricia's voice rang out, too sweet to be sincere. "We already finished eating. We didn't expect you to be late." I didn't even try to hide the frustration creeping into my voice. "The reservation was for 7:30. I said, a cold edge in my words. Claire scoffed, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Impossible. It was at 6. I made sure of it." I pulled out my phone, opening the message from my mother. The words were unmistakable. "Please come at 7:30. My heart sank as I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. They had set me up. Made me come all the way here to pay for a meal they had already consumed. "What is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You expect me to pay for this?" Without missing a beat, Patricia straightened her shoulders and said, "Exactly. Since you were late, you'll cover the bill. It was supposed to be for your baby shower. After all." My eyes scanned the bill on the table. The total amount nearly $2. The extravagant 4-course dinner, 2 bottles of fine wine, and additional desserts were all things I had never wanted. Things that my family had insisted on. I felt a surge of anger. But I didn't let it show. I had learned long ago that confronting them head-on was a waste of energy. Just then, the sound of calm footsteps approached. And I turned to see Jonathan walking toward us. His presence in the room felt like a breath of fresh air. His tall frame cutting through the suffocating atmosphere that my family had created. "Sorry to keep you waiting." His voice was calm, dignified, but it was the aura around him, unshaken by the pretensions of my family, that made him stand out. Patricia's voice softened, an obvious shift in her demeanor. "Oh, Jason, glad you could join us." But then, following Jonathan, the restaurant's owner, Chef Lou Martin, appeared. His entrance was like a thunderclap in the quiet room. And as he stepped forward, I could see my family's expressions change. Their smugness replaced by confusion and a hint of dread. "Mrs. Anderson," Lou began, his voice respectful, but firm. "Thank you for visiting the flagship restaurant of Miller Hospitality Group." Miller Hospitality Group? The words hung in the air like a bombshell. And I could see the color drain from my mother's face as realization set in. Jonathan, my Jonathan, wasn't just a small businessman, as they had so long believed. He was the owner of a restaurant empire. Jason continued, his tone cool but with a sharp edge. "I manage 5 upscale restaurants in Chicago, including Lysander. We have records of today's reservation, and the surveillance footage from this evening. Your time tampering and fraudulent billing won't go unnoticed." I watched as my mother's face contorted, her arrogance replaced by fear. My father, usually the one who tried to control every situation, was speechless, his palms sweating, and Claire, always so composed, looked like she might drop her phone in shock. This is a misunderstanding," my father stammered, his voice quivering in disbelief. "No," Jonathan replied coldly, his eyes narrowing as he stood tall, unflinching. "This is premeditated fraud, and this is just the tip of the iceberg." With that, he pulled out a black leather briefcase, and the sound of its lock clicking open echoed around the room. My family watched in stunned silence as he revealed the documents inside: transaction records, fake invoicing, and evidence of illegal loans. My heart pounded in my chest. I had suspected something wasn't right with my family's business dealings, but seeing the hard evidence laid out before me felt like a punch to the gut. Jonathan's voice was steady as he spoke again, this time turning to my father. "Since the 2008 real estate crisis, your company has been effectively bankrupt. All of the lavish appearances were funded through illicit means. Fraudulent transactions. Your company was living a lie. A lie built on the backs of people you claimed to respect." The room grew colder with each word he spoke. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father and mother, the people who had always prided themselves on their image, break. The truth was more damaging than any scandal, and the illusion they had so carefully maintained was crumbling around them. But it wasn't just the business that had been dishonest, it was everything. Years of manipulation, deceit, and self-righteous pride had poisoned every interaction we had ever had. I had lived in their world of lies for far too long. And now, the truth was coming to light, and I could finally see them for what they truly were. Jonathan turned to Claire, who had been sitting in stunned silence. "And you, Claire," he said, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable authority. "Here are the findings of your divorce and financial situation. You've been taking a salary from your father's company for years, but the sales are zero. You've been living off of them, pretending to be something you're not." Her face went white, and I saw the mask of perfection she had worn for years crack. Claire had always been the golden child in their eyes, but she was no better than the rest of them. And now, the truth was out. The silence that followed was suffocating. But it wasn't just the weight of the revelations that hung in the air. It was the weight of the years of manipulation and deceit finally coming to an end. As the silence in the room stretched, the weight of the truth hung heavily between us. My parents, once so proud of their status and wealth, now stood exposed, no longer the towering figures they once were. Claire, once untouchable, crumbled under the reality of her own deceit. It was hard to feel anything but relief. For years, I had been caught in the web of their lies, trying to fit into a world that was never mine. But now, it was over. I was free from the chains they had tried to bind me with. Free to live my life on my own terms. Jonathan stood beside me, unwavering, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. My family had lived a life of vanity and falsehood. But I had chosen honesty, integrity, and love. With Jonathan, I had built something real. We had created a life grounded in values that mattered, not in appearances. As we left the restaurant, leaving behind the broken remnants of a family that had never truly understood me, I felt a sense of peace. For the first time, I knew that the choices I had made were the right ones. And as we stepped into the future, hand in hand, I knew that nothing would ever stand in the way of the life we had built. If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for new videos from Life Stories. Thank you for watching.